In the summer of 1683, an enormous Ottoman army, possibly as large as 150,000 soldiers, stood at the gates of Vienna, poised to shatter that heart. For the city's defenders, outnumbered and feeling abandoned, there was little hope. For 2 agonizing months, Vienna would be starved, battered, and burrowed beneath, brought to the very brink of annihilation. But a fatal miscalculation by the Ottoman commander and a desperate last-ditch defense would set the stage for one of the most stunning reversals in history. This is the story of how a city on the edge of doom was saved by one of the largest and most decisive cavalry charges ever recorded. To understand how 2 empires collided at the walls of Vienna, we have to look at the world they lived in. The late 17th century was an age of giants. In the West, you had the France of King Louis XIV, the Sun King, a power of immense cultural and military prestige, always looking to expand its influence. In the East, the Ottoman Empire remained a colossal force, a sprawling domain stretching from North Africa, across the Middle East, and deep into the Balkans. But this was an empire wrestling with its own legacy. The glorious days of expansion under Suleiman the Magnificent were a century in the past. Internal strife and the sheer difficulty of maintaining such a vast state had begun to take their toll. The empire wasn't the unstoppable force it had once been, and at the court of Sultan Mehmed IV, there was a deep hunger to reclaim that former glory. That hunger was personified in one man, Grand Vizier Merciful Kar Mustafa Pasha. Kar Mustafa wasn't born to power. He was the adopted son of a powerful family who rose through the ranks with a mix of skill, ambition, and political savvy. He'd led campaigns and negotiated treaties, but he craved a victory that would etch his name in history. He saw himself as the man to succeed where even the great Suleiman had failed in 1529, the conquest of Vienna. For Kar Mustafa, this was more than a strategic goal. It was a crusade, a holy war that would outshine the legends of the past and secure his own power. By all accounts, he was an arrogant man, utterly confident in his abilities and possessed of a burning hatred for his Christian rivals. His primary rival was the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold, the first ruler of the sprawling and often divided Habsburg lands. In many ways, Leopold was Kara Mustafa's opposite. He wasn't a warrior king. He was a deeply pious, scholarly, and often indecisive ruler who was more comfortable in the concert halls of his court than on a battlefield. He was also famously unattractive, with the pronounced Habsburg jaw that marked his family's generations of inbreeding. But beneath this exterior was a deep sense of duty. His empire, however, was vulnerable. To the west, France's Louis XIV was a constant threat, actively working to undermine Habsburg power. So much so that France actually gave quiet encouragement to the Ottomans, seeing their advance as a convenient way to weaken a rival. The final trigger for the war came from inside Leopold's own territory. In royal Hungary, a Protestant nobleman named Imre Turki was leading a rebellion against Habsburg rule. Theoli and his rebels appealed to the Ottomans for support, and Kara Mustafa jumped at the chance. He convinced Sultan Mehmed IV that this was the perfect excuse for a major campaign. The Sultan's initial orders were actually modest: just operate in western Hungary and capture a few forts. But Kara Mustafa had far grander designs. Vienna was always his real target. On March 31st, 1683, a formal declaration of war arrived at the court in Vienna. The very next day, the Ottoman army began its march. It was a force of staggering proportions, with a main army numbering around 150,000, including elite Janissary infantry and Sipahi cavalry. They were led by a force of 40,000 Crimean Tatars, whose job was to spread terror by burning villages and taking slaves, clearing a path for the main host. News of this approaching juggernaut sent a wave of panic across Austria. Leopold's position was dire. His own army was small and his German allies were far away and slow to mobilize. His greatest hope lay with Poland. After tense negotiations, they'd signed the Treaty of Warsaw. It was a defensive alliance. If the Ottomans attacked the Polish city of Kiev, Leopold would help. If they attacked Vienna, King John III's Swiss of Poland would come to his aid. It was an alliance born of mutual desperation. But as the Ottoman host drew closer, one question hung over all of Europe: would that shield hold? As the summer of 1683 began, The Ottoman war machine moved with terrifying speed. Shah Mustafa, obsessed with his grand prize, bypassed many of the smaller forts that could have slowed him down. His eyes were fixed on Vienna. The Tatar horde fanned out ahead, creating a cordon of destruction. Villages were torched and those who couldn't escape were killed or enslaved. A brutal strategy designed to sow chaos. The wave of terror soon reached Vienna itself. On July 7th, with the enemy closing in, Emperor Leopold I fled the city. It was a devastating blow to morale. To the Viennese, it looked like cowardice, but it was also a strategic necessity. The emperor's capture would have meant immediate surrender. Leopold retreated to the city of Passau, where he could desperately work to assemble the promised relief army. Left to face the storm was a man of iron will, Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starberg. A veteran field marshal, Starberg was made military governor of Vienna, and his task was monumental. He had a garrison of just 15,000 men, a mix of regular soldiers and a citizen militia, to defend a city against an army 10 times its size. Vienna's fortifications were strong, but no wall can stand forever. Starberg's greatest assets were his own grim determination and the courage of the Viennese people. On July 14, 1683, the siege began. The vast Ottoman army surrounded the city, a sea of tents stretching to the horizon. Shah Mustafa sent a messenger demanding surrender. Starberg's refusal was blunt. "Let him come. I'll fight to the last drop of blood." He knew what surrender meant. He'd heard of the massacre at the nearby town of Perkeldorf, where citizens who surrendered were slaughtered anyway. There would be no surrender. It was then that Shah Mustafa made his first fatal error. Confident that terror alone would force a quick surrender and wanting to preserve the city's riches for himself, he decided against an all-out immediate assault. Even more critically, to speed up his march, he had left most of his heavy siege cannons behind. His lighter field guns weren't powerful enough to smash Vienna's bastions, so unable to batter his way in, he was forced to dig his way in. This marked the beginning of a war beneath the earth. The Ottomans, masters of siegecraft, carved an intricate web of zigzagging trenches that crept ever closer to Vienna's walls. From these trenches, their sappers tunneled deep underground, aiming to undermine the city's very foundations. Their plan was ruthless: pack the mines with gunpowder and blast open gaping breaches in the defenses. For nearly 2 months, the struggle turned into a hidden battle of wits below the surface. Vienna's defenders, guided by skilled engineers, countered with their own tunnels. Life inside the city became an agony of silence and listening. In cellars, people balanced drums with dried peas scattered on top. When Ottoman diggers moved underground, the faint vibration sent the peas trembling, betraying the enemy's location. Armed with this knowledge, the Viennese launched their own countermines, leading to terrifying encounters in pitch-black tunnels, where men fought at arm's length with pistols, blades, and shovels, choking on dust and fear in the darkness. Above ground, life in Vienna descended into a living hell. The city was completely cut off. Food disappeared. People were reduced to eating cats, dogs, and rats. Starvation was compounded by disease as dysentery swept through the city, killing more people than the cannons. The fatigue was so extreme that Starberg issued a standing order. Any soldier found asleep on watch was to be shot, yet the defense held. Citizens, including women and children, worked tirelessly to repair the damage from the constant bombardment. As August bled into September, the city was on its last legs. The garrison was down to just a few thousand able-bodied fighters. Ammunition was critically low. Their only hope was the relief army. But were they coming? To get messages out, Vienna relied on incredibly brave spies. The most famous was Georg Kolchitsky, who spoke fluent Turkish, disguised himself as an Ottoman soldier, and slipped through enemy lines multiple times to carry messages, bringing back news that kept hope alive. To signal their desperation, the defenders fired rockets every night from the top of St. Stephen's Cathedral, a fiery plea for help. By early September, Shah Mustafa knew the city was at its breaking point. On September 4th, his miners finally detonated a huge mine beneath the Berg Bastion, blasting a wide gap in the walls. Ferocious assaults followed, but Starberg himself led the defense, fighting alongside his men to repel wave after wave. By the second week of September, the Ottomans had secured a foothold in the outer defenses and were preparing one final massive mine to shatter the inner walls. For the defenders of Vienna, time had run out. While Vienna suffered, an unlikely coalition was slowly coming together. The central figure was the man on whom Vienna's fate now depended. John III Soys, king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Sobieski was a living legend and one of the most brilliant military commanders of his age. He'd spent much of his life fighting the Ottomans and understood their way of war better than almost anyone. He was bound by treaty, but his motivation was more than just duty. He saw this as a pivotal moment for Christendom, a chance to strike a decisive blow against a historic enemy and secure his own legacy as the savior of Europe. Assembling the relief army was a nightmare. Leopold's diplomats, funded by Pope Innocent X-11th, scrambled across the German states begging for troops. Eventually, an army of the Holy Roman Empire, led by Charles of Lorraine, joined with forces from Bavaria, Saxony, and other principalities. They gathered at Toulaon on the Danube, where on September 6th, Sobieski and his Polish army finally arrived after a grueling march. The combined Christian army known as the Holy League numbered around 80,000 men. Though still outnumbered, it was a formidable force. Command was given to Soys out of respect for his experience. At a tense war council, the German commanders argued for a conservative plan to cut off Ottoman supply lines. Sobieski would have none of it. He argued for a direct, decisive battle to crush the enemy in a single stroke. His will prevailed. Their path, however, was blocked by the dense, hilly Vienna woods. This is where Mustafa made his second critical error. He was so consumed with the siege, so convinced the city was his, that he failed to properly secure the passes through the woods. He left the approaches to his camp dangerously exposed, keeping his best troops bogged down in the siege trenches, ready for the final assault. He had fatally underestimated his opponent. In a remarkable feat of logistics, the entire Holy League army crossed the Vienna woods in just a few days. On the night of September 11th, they reached the heights of the Kahlenberg, a series of hills overlooking the city and the vast Ottoman camp below. In the pre-dawn darkness of September 12th, as the final Ottoman assault on Vienna was beginning, the Allied forces deployed along the ridge. As the sun rose, the defenders in the city looked up and saw them. Salvation was at hand. A signal cannon fired, a holy mass was held, and the battle for Vienna began. The fighting started around dawn. For the entire day, a brutal, grinding battle raged across the foothills. Mustafa was caught completely off guard. Now fighting a war on two fronts, trying to take the city with a massive army at his back. He was slow and indecisive, fatally reluctant to pull his elite janissaries out of the trenches. Slowly but surely, the Allied infantry pushed the disorganized Ottoman forces back. By late afternoon, the Ottoman lines were stretched and demoralized. Sobieski, watching from the high ground, saw his moment. He arrayed his cavalry for the final blow. It was a sight that has echoed through history. 18,000 horsemen spread across the ridge, preparing for one of the largest cavalry charges of all time. At the very tip of this armored spear were 3,000 of his elite Polish Winged Hussars. They were one of the most fearsome cavalry units in the world, famous for the massive feathered wings worn on their backs that created a terrifying silhouette and a deafening clatter as they charged. At around 5 p.m., Soys gave the order with a cry of, "God is our protector, swing." He personally led the charge. What followed wasn't just a charge, it was an avalanche. An eyewitness described it as a sound like a thunderbolt as tons of armored men and horses cascaded down the slopes. They smashed into the Ottoman line with irresistible force. The weary Ottoman soldiers, already fighting for hours, had no answer. Their formations shattered. The charge broke the Ottoman center and drove directly towards Shah Mustafa's lavish command tent. The Grand Vizier, seeing the wave of destruction rolling towards him, simply fled. The battle had become a rout. The collapse of the Ottoman army was total and chaotic. It wasn't a retreat, it was a panicked flight. Boiling with rage, Shah Mustafa briefly ordered his men to massacre their prisoners before he himself fled for his life. Grabbing only the sacred banner of the Prophet to prevent its capture, he left behind a scene of unimaginable riches. The victorious soldiers and starving citizens of Vienna poured into the abandoned Ottoman camp, which was more like a city unto itself. It took them a full week to gather all the spoils. As the sun rose, the defenders in the city looked up and saw them. Salvation was at hand. A signal cannon fired, a holy mass was held, and the battle for Vienna began. The fighting started around dawn. For the entire day, a brutal, grinding battle raged across the foothills. Khan Mustafa was caught completely off guard. Now fighting a war on two fronts, trying to take the city with a massive army at his back. He was slow and indecisive, fatally reluctant to pull his elite janissaries out of the trenches. Slowly but surely, the Allied infantry pushed the disorganized Ottoman forces back. By late afternoon, the Ottoman lines were stretched and demoralized. So Basi, watching from the high ground, saw his moment. He arrayed his cavalry for the final blow. It was a sight that has echoed through history. 18,000 horsemen spread across the ridge, preparing for one of the largest cavalry charges of all time. At the very tip of this armored spear were 3,000 of his elite Polish winged house. They were one of the most fearsome cavalry units in the world, famous for the massive feathered wings worn on their backs that created a terrifying silhouette and a deafening clatter as they charged. At around 5 p.m., Soares gave the order with a cry of, "God is our protector, swing." He personally led the charge. What followed wasn't just a charge, it was an avalanche. An eyewitness described it as a sound like a thunderbolt as tons of armored men and horses cascaded down the slopes. They smashed into the Ottoman line with irresistible force. The weary Ottoman soldiers, already fighting for hours, had no answer. Their formations shattered. The charge broke the Ottoman center and drove directly towards Khan Mustafa's lavish command tent. The Grand Vizier, seeing the wave of destruction rolling towards him, simply fled. The battle had become a rout. The collapse of the Ottoman army was total and chaotic. It wasn't a retreat, it was a panicked flight. Boiling with rage, Khan Mustafa briefly ordered his men to massacre their prisoners before he himself fled for his life. Grabbing only the sacred banner of the Prophet to prevent its capture, he left behind a scene of unimaginable riches. The victorious soldiers and starving citizens of Vienna poured into the abandoned Ottoman camp, which was more like a city unto itself. It took them a full week to gather all the spoils.